Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them and give us a review on your podcast app of choice. In the early decades of the 19th century, Mexico, newly independent from Spain, struggled to assert control over its northernmost provinces. Among them was Texas, a vast, thinly populated frontier contested by indigenous nations, opportunistic settlers, and an increasingly unstable central government. By the 1820s, Mexico had opened its borders to Anglo-American settlers under strict conditions. Loyalty to the Mexican Constitution of 1824 and conversion to Catholicism, yet enforcement was weak, and cultural allegiance remained distant. Within a few short years, Anglo settlers outnumbered Mexican citizens 5-1, creating a demographic and political imbalance that the Mexican authorities could neither reverse nor control. As Mexico drifted towards centralized authoritarian rule under Antonio López de Santa Anna, resistance hardened in Texas. What began as a movement to defend constitutional rights soon evolved into a fight for full independence. In this collision of military power, political failure, and frontier determination, a small outpost would become the stage for a confrontation that produced more than a simple military defeat. Its outcome altered the balance of North America. The survival of the Texian rebellion led directly to the establishment of the Republic of Texas, the annexation of that republic into the United States in the Mexican-American War of 1846. That war redrew the map of the continent, transferring vast territories stretching from Texas to California into American hands. These conquests laid the groundwork for the rise of the United States as a continental power, shaped the political conflicts that led to the American Civil War, and influenced the global order that followed. The events that unfolded in that isolated compound in 1836 were not merely the concerns of Texas, nor even of Mexico. They shaped the fate of nations. Let's now experience the Siege of the Alamo.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 41, The Alamo. From the 23rd of February to the 6th of March, 1836. Texan forces, 189 men. Mexican forces, between 4,000 and 6,000 men. The fall of the Alamo ignited a fierce, unrelenting resistance to Santa Anna's advance, forging the resolve that would drive his army into the dirt and wrest from him the independence of Texas.
In 1821, when Mexico finally tore itself free from the grip of Spain, the capital became a revolving door of rulers, each more uncertain than the last. With no clear vision for the nation's future, men seized power and threw titles upon themselves: emperor, president, dictator, as if the name alone could command loyalty. In 1823, Emperor Agustin de Iturbide, desperate to hold Mexico's remote frontiers, struck a deal with an unlikely partner, an American named Moses Austin, tasked with planting settlers in the wild province of Texas. 3 centuries of Spanish dominion had barely scratched Texas, where the Comanche ruled the southern plains with absolute violent force, crushing every attempt to settle or missionize in their path. To Mexico's leaders, Austin's Americans were more than settlers. They were cannon fodder, a human shield to protect the scant 4,000 Mexican citizens clinging to Texas. What Iturbide could not foresee was that Austin's small project would light a fuse that, in less than a lifetime, would blast away half of Mexico's domain. In 1823, Texas was a land of emptiness, broken only by 2 struggling towns, San Antonio to the west and Nacogdoches to the east. After Moses Austin's sudden death, his son Stephen F. Austin stepped up, took the title of Empresario, and wisely chose to settle his 300 families not in the jaws of the Comanche, but between the Colorado and Brazos rivers, halfway between the 2 Mexican towns. Austin handpicked his Old 300, as he called them, tough, frugal farmers and ranchers whose love of their land would chain them to order, for men who sweat for their property rarely rise against authority. Iturbide's worries were short-lived. He was soon swept from power, replaced by a government that preached liberal reforms with revolutionary zeal. In 1824, the new regime hammered out a constitution heavily modeled on the United States, and the settlers eagerly pledged loyalty, a small price, for 4,400 acres of Mexican land handed to each. They were asked for only two things: loyalty to the Constitution and conversion to Catholicism, though everyone knew the second demand would be left to rot on paper. More impresarios followed, flooding Texas with settlers until, by 1830, Anglo-Texans outnumbered Mexican-born citizens 5-1. Confident that they had enough muscle on the frontier, the Mexican authorities slammed the door shut, halting legal immigration into Texas. Yet within 3 years, 10,000 more crossed illegally, embedding a spirit of defiance into Texas that would never quite die. By 1833, a new power rose in Mexico, and with it came a colder, harder gaze toward the Anglo-Texans growing restless on the frontier. That year, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, draped in the glory of repelling Spain's final attempt to reclaim Mexico in 1829, seized the presidency for himself. At the peak of ambition, Santa Anna withdrew to his grand estates, letting his vice president shoulder the burden of reforms. Had they succeeded, he would have claimed the triumph, but they failed. By 1834, Santa Anna stormed back to power, swept the 1824 Constitution into dust, and crowned himself dictator in all but name. When Zacatecas dared to resist, Santa Anna unleashed his army without mercy, crushing the province and butchering every man who hinted at defiance. Turning his eyes north, Santa Anna saw the Anglo-Texans and knew they would never bow to a man who ruled by decree. And so in the fall of 1835, he dispatched troops into Texas under the thin excuse that the settlers had broken their vow to embrace Catholicism, though both sides knew the real battle was over obedience. At Gonzales, a clash over a small cannon on October the 1st ignited the first shots of the Texas Revolution, a fire that had smoldered for years under the weight of Mexican red tape and Anglo defiance. General Martin Perfecto de Caz, Santa Anna's brother-in-law, led his forces back to San Antonio, only to find himself bottled up and besieged by the rising Texian militia by late November. In mid-December, Texian fighters slipped into San Antonio, battling house to house for a bloody week until they captured the town. Then, with unexpected magnanimity, they paroled the beaten Mexican troops, knowing Santa Anna would come north, thirsting for vengeance, but guessing he wouldn't arrive before spring. Most of the 600 Texians melted away into their homes. Roughly 150 remained behind, scraping by on thin rations and stubborn pride amid the crumbling streets of San Antonio. Meanwhile, in December, the settlers formed a provisional government and named Sam Houston, a hard, seasoned man, as commander of the Texian army. Houston, knowing San Antonio was a death trap, ordered Jim Bowie to pull the garrison out before it was too late. But Bowie found something in San Antonio that seized him, an old, battered mission that had once housed Mexican troops, known to history as the Alamo. Armed with captured Mexican cannons and sheer grit, the defenders were already patching up the Alamo's failing walls. Bowie sent back a message to Houston. He was staying. The Alamo would not fall without a fight. Houston dispatched a young firebrand, William Barrett Travis, to pull them out, but Travis, once he set eyes on the place, threw in his lot with Bowie's defiant stand. By late February, just over 150 men held the Alamo when, to their shock and their fury, Santa Anna's forces came roaring into view. Long before the word of Caz's defeat reached him, Santa Anna had already wrung loans from the coffers of Mexico City, fueling his march north with gold seized by intimidation. By the time Santa Anna's army, a grim column of regulars and pressed conscripts, neared the Rio Grande, they met Caz retreating south, broken and beaten. At the sight of Kaz's battered forces, Santa Anna's rage boiled over. He swore a vengeance so complete that Texas would drown in its own defiance. On February 23, 1836, Santa Anna reached San Antonio and unleashed his army, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 strong, to encircle the Alamo, like a noose tightening on the neck of a condemned man. He ordered the cannons to blast without pause day and night, pounding the battered mission while the defenders, starved of gunpowder, could do little more than endure. Inside the Alamo, they had cannon aplenty, but precious little powder to feed them. The siege lines were loose, and when Bowie fell ill, Travis seized command, sending 3 riders through the gaps in the Mexican lines to beg for reinforcements. In his letters, Travis wore the mask of bravery, but between the lines, the desperation bled through. 32 men from Gonzales answered the call, slipping through the darkness and braving Mexican lines to reach the dying fortress. With their arrival, the Alamo's defenders now stood at roughly 189 men, though history leaves room for debate on the exact count. It was a pitifully small band to defend a perimeter that wrapped around the old church, 2 barracks, and a yawning open courtyard. The mission's walls were thick, once enough to keep Comanche raiders at bay, but they were never meant to withstand the iron hail of modern artillery. That the defenders held out 13 days owes less to their own strength and more to the poor marksmanship of Santa Anna's gunners, who wasted shot after shot against stubborn stone. The Mexican artillery stayed well back at first, for Santa Anna's men quickly learned that the Texian riflemen inside could drop a soldier at a distance with brutal accuracy. On the night of March 5th, the cannons fell silent for the first time since the siege began. Weary Texian guards strained to stay alert, suspicious of the sudden quiet that pressed in after days of thunder. Under the cover of night, Santa Anna's infantry crept into assault positions, sharpening their bayonets and steeling themselves for a slaughter at dawn. An overeager shout from the Mexican ranks shattered the silence, and in that instant, the defenders knew the hour had come. In the dark confusion, with many of Santa Anna's troops raw and green, the first assault stumbled and broke against the Alamo's battered walls. Texian riflemen, grim and steady, hurled back the first attack, but Santa Anna's officers rallied their men, and on the second charge, the Mexicans surged over the broken walls. Inside the mission, the defenders were outnumbered by staggering odds, and from that moment, the end was no longer in doubt. William Travis is said to have died early, pistol and sword in hand, while Jim Bowie, racked with illness, fought briefly from his cot before being cut down and slaughtered. The last stand fell to the men holed up inside the church, but without heavy arms, they were doomed from the start. Mexican accounts tell of many defenders, perhaps half, trying to break out to the southeast only to be cut down mercilessly by cavalry lying in wait. By 8 o'clock that morning, it was finished. The Alamo had fallen. In the 1970s, a diary surfaced, said to belong to Enrique de la Peña, an officer who had ridden at Santa Anna's side. Historians to this day argue over its authenticity, but within its pages, the final moments of the Alamo are painted in a way that shattered the old heroic legends. Since 1836, it had been gospel that every man at the Alamo died fighting to the last breath, but de la Peña wrote that a few, including former U.S. Congressman Davy Crockett, were captured alive. Santa Anna's officers pleaded for mercy for them, but the general, true to his brutal code, ordered the prisoners slaughtered as traitors. One of the enduring tales of the siege is that young William Travis, just 26 years old, drew a line in the dirt with his sword, asking those who would stand and die with him to cross it. The story goes that every man crossed but one, a French veteran named Moses Rose, who slipped away into the night. Whether Travis ever drew that line is a matter of pure speculation. The story didn't surface until decades later, and the few surviving women never spoke of it. The Alamo was a battle that never should have been fought. A brutal stand in the wrong place at the wrong time. A guerrilla war, fast and mobile, suited to Texas and the rough men who called it home, would have bled Santa Anna dry far better than any last stand at a crumbling mission. The Alamo was a ghost, too far from help. Houston knew it. While Travis and Bowie clung to the dreams of reinforcements, Houston never had any intention of marching to San Antonio's rescue. The Alamo's fall delayed Santa Anna less than a fortnight, but the sacrifice lit a fire across Texas and the South, driving men in droves to Houston's ragged army. Knowing the art of war, Houston withdrew before Santa Anna's advancing columns, just as the settlers fled, until it was the Mexican army itself that stretched too thin across the wild country. Santa Anna, still drunk on his ambition, split his army to spread terror, and it was a fatal mistake. On April the 21st, Houston struck at San Jacinto with fewer than 800 men, smashing Santa Anna's 1,500 in a brutal, unstoppable attack, which we covered in Season 1. Santa Anna's capture sealed his humiliation. At gunpoint, he signed the Treaty of Velasco, granting Texas its independence. Years later, when Texas joined the U.S., that same treaty would help ignite the Mexican-American War of 1846. When that war ended, it was not just Texas that had changed hands. It was all of northern Mexico, stretching clear to the Pacific Ocean, swallowed up by the United States. Back at the start of the Alamo siege on March 2nd, Texas's provisional government had already declared independence, though few inside the old mission would live to hear it. When the smoke of the war finally lifted, it was not just Texas that slipped from Mexico's grasp. It was a continent's worth of dreams. From the banks of the Rio Grande to the distant Pacific shores, half of Mexico's northern empire had been carved away, claimed by the rising power of the United States. But in the desperate early days, before empires shifted and flags changed, something even greater was born in blood. On March 2nd, while the Alamo stood surrounded and doomed, a ragged handful of Texian cowboys had already declared their independence, a declaration that few inside the battered mission would live to see, let alone celebrate. But the men inside those crumbling walls fought on anyway, not for the land, not even for victory, but for a principle, the right to choose their own destiny. They died without knowing that they had lit a fire that would roar across centuries. And as they fell, as their blood soaked the dry Texas earth, it was not the Lone Star flag that waved above them. It was the Mexican tricolor that they raised, its proud eagle torn away, and the date 1824 stitched in its heart. A final, defiant stand for a broken constitution and a nation that had already abandoned them. They fought not just for Texas. They fought for the right of free men everywhere to stand and to die on their own terms. Hope you enjoyed that. Let's now descend into the killing fields of the comment section. On our episode on Fort Stanwix during the Revolutionary War, user Blueberry Bubblegum wrote, "Without French help, America is still under British rule today." Blueberry, absolutely, there's real truth in that. Without French intervention, without their fleets, their gold, their armies, Washington's threadbare homespun forces would have likely been strangled by the British Empire. Supplies would have ran out, enlistments would have dried up, morale would have continued to waver, and the revolution might have collapsed into memory rather than into history. But here's the sharper edge of the sword. French help didn't fall from the sky. It wasn't born out of sympathy, and it wasn't inevitable. France threw its weight into our war only after Americans proved that they could stand, they could fight, and they could win. Victories like Saratoga weren't just battlefield successes. They were a signal flare to the world, especially to France and other European powers, that this cause had teeth, that it had staying power. Without American grit, In those brutal early years, there would have been no French gamble, no French fleet sailing across the Atlantic to our aid. So yes, without France, the revolution likely fails. But without American grit, France never lifts a finger. Both mattered. Both changed the world. And we are in your debt, but the story doesn't end there. Over a century later, when American soldiers landed on the blood-soaked shores of France during World War I, General John J. Pershing's aide famously declared, "Lafayette, we are here." It wasn't just a dramatic entrance, a dramatic flourish. It was a reminder that history had come full circle, an acknowledgement that two peoples who once fought side by side for liberty would stand together again when freedom called. Across centuries, across oceans, we have held the line for each other. Thanks for listening. See you guys tomorrow.